Okay, so I have the privilege of hanging out today with a bunch of my friends from Twitter, so that we can talk about uh, some things that we all have in common in terms of our concerns about the world. And one of those is that we suck at talking to each other about stuff, especially through the medium of social media. But then nowadays it's spilling out into the real world. So I've got some friends here with me. Eric Smith, why don't you introduce yourself first and tell us who you are and why you also care about people sucking at talking to each other?
Okay, I am Eric Smith, co-founder of Free Black Thought, associate professor of rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania. Why I care about broken discourse? Well, I'm a professor of rhetoric. It's my job to care about this. So as long as somebody's paying me, no, I'm kidding. I care because I've seen the devolution of academic discourse in my field. If we can't talk about certain things because it offends somebody, then we're no longer academics. And I don't see that as a very good thing. On a good day, it saddens me. On a bad day, it pisses me off. So that's why I'm here.
All right. Angel Eduardo's here too.
Hey guys, yeah. I really echo everything Eric said, except for the getting paid part. um, I'm a writer, musician, artist, and I guess I moonlight as a communicator, facilitator. I'm trying to make sense, and I'm trying to do it with compassion, and I'm trying to do it in the thunderdome of social media, where discourse goes to die. um, and it matters because I think everything we have accomplished, anything good that we have done as a species, is the result of a series of successful communications. And if that fails, we fail. So I'm just here to try to save the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we have from the beautiful mountains of Colorado, Monica Guzman. Welcome. Who are you?
Hello. Yes, I am a digital director and storytelling director at Braver Angels, which is the largest nonpartisan grassroots organization working to depolarize America. Um, yeah, and this is extremely important to me. I've been a journalist my whole career, and I used to think that it was because my mission was to tell stories. Now I realize it's because my mission is to help people understand each other. It was something deeper all along. Definitely hit a wall in journalism over the last few years because because I saw the industry seem to get less curious about people and a little more afraid. And all for understandable reasons. But anyway, that has made me take a step back and look at a bigger picture. What are we telling stories into? What expectations do we have for each other when we tell stories? And how do we choose who to believe and who to trust and which stories to dismiss outright and which ones to actually consider? So that tension that exists today between being heard at all costs, right? Like the publishing revolution, social media, but also hearing and listening and knowing what that even means. I think that's one of the most like consequential tugs of war happening in society right now. And I'm definitely like really putting my thumb on the scale of listening because I think it's off.
Yeah, my goodness, absolutely. I care about this from a different angle. Maybe on this little group. In this little group, we have some areas of in common, in that Eric and I are both teachers, and then we have Angel and Monica are writers and journalists in that kind of world. But for me, I kind of come at this as from the education perspective of where I find that I can get teenagers very easily to have fantastic conversations about almost any topic when they're in person. And when they can see each other's humanity. And then I become frustrated that I know that as they stop being teenagers, they're going to leave my classroom and go out into the world, and likely never be around as many people all in one room. I have classes of 100 kids, And so we have these, these great conversations. Then they're going to go out into the social media world and they're going to lose that ability. And that scares me, because I think there are like something that Angel said too, which I think is really important, of all of our great things that we've come up with as humans have come from communication in some way. Matt Ridley has a really great book called The Rational Optimist. He also has a TED Talk called When Ideas Have Sex. And it's fantastic, because it sets out for us in a very biological way how if I come to you with my idea and you come to me with your idea, the synthesis of what's the best parts of both of those ideas is often what rises to the top. And if we remove our ability to do that across billions of people, I see like a catastrophe coming. So that's why I care about this. So one of the things that I know that we suck at talking about the most right now is race. I think we suck at talking about COVID too, but that's maybe another for another conversation on another day. So what, from your guys' perspective, I don't know how old we all are. I don't know what age range we fall into, but I know that I feel like it was easier to talk about certain things related to race 15 years ago than it is now. Do you guys observe that, or am I crazy?
7 years ago, I would say.
Yeah.
Maybe even 6.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
And so, Eric, you had that 6 or 7 years. Elaborate on that. What do you mean?
Well, I just started noticing. Actually, okay, so a lot of the people in my field who are pushing the woke agenda were doing the same thing in like the late 90s when I met them, right? And I had arguments with them then. Little did I know. I mean, if you would have told me then that they'd start being the leaders and winning, I would have laughed at you. I didn't take it seriously. I'm not like, these guys are idiots. There's no way this is gonna, catch any steam here. But it did. And around 2015, I started noticing that those people were in leadership positions, whether they are faculty or administrators, and they were pushing this agenda and basically punishing people who didn't come along with it. I started noticing that then around 2015, 2016. Trump's election didn't help either. So this is all to say that, that's when I really started noticing things. And I really started realizing that this term woke wasn't what I thought it was. I used to like that term. I thought it just meant aware, right? Aware of the nuances of things, the things that are kind of behind the scenes and things like that. It's become something different in my mind. So, yeah.
And guys, by the way, don't feel like you have to wait for me to invite you to say stuff. Just jump in if you've got stuff to say.
I was going to ask Eric, when you said that you used to like the term woke, you said it used to mean aware, but did it mean something more back when you did like it? Did it have a point of view beyond just awareness?
Well, yes. And the point of view was along, racial, ethnic lines, right? And then knowing what's really going on and things like that. What wasn't happening, though, is this projection of bad faith onto so many people who, didn't abide wholeheartedly by a particular ideology. That wasn't there. It wasn't so vicious at the time, right? It was more in line with just, gaining knowledge, be aware, read books, know about history and things like that. That's what I thought it was. And being a professor, I like those ideas, but it's not that.
Yeah, I had an experience in about, I want to say it's would have been summer of 2019, where one of my Black friends stayed at my house for a week. He was in town doing some music stuff, and he is not very politically plugged in. So he's not on Twitter. He doesn't read the blogs. He's not really in that world. And I brought up to him that the word woke is becoming used by white people a lot. And he just went, what are you talking about? What do they mean when they say it? Because I know what I mean when I say it. And we had this fascinating conversation with somebody not plugged into that world at all, where I'm trying to explain what woke means now to a Black guy who has been using that term in for a while in his vernacular, but it meant something different. And it was it was like two worlds that were not connected.
Right.
It's pretty interesting. I actually wanted to talk a little bit more about that term anyway, because we've got
similarly, I want to know sort of to what extent is that term useful, even as a locus of conversation about what we really want to get at. Like sometimes words are the way and sometimes they get in the way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to tell the difference.
Yeah, I think actually Chris and I talked about this when I did my choreography talk with you. That basically, if you spend more time trying to hash out what the definition of the word is than you do talking about whatever the thing is, the word is now completely useless, right? Like you might as well just abandon it and just go with whatever the idea the word was meant to encapsulate. Just jump to that. You'll save yourself 45 minutes or an hour or more. And oftentimes, if you don't go through that step of making sure you're using the same definition or you understand what you each mean by whatever term it is, you might be having a conversation kind of, might be crossing your wires and not even realizing it. You might be an hour into an argument and then you realize, oh my God, okay. So this entire time you've thought this meant that, and I thought it meant this. And that's why we didn't understand it or agree. And that's why we were confusing each other. So
it's going to seem like a non sequitur, but I want to see if you guys even know what I'm talking about. So in Seattle, we have these little traffic circles within residential neighborhoods, so that you get into like a corner of a couple blocks where there's nothing but houses, like an intersection. But instead of just being able to take a left, there's actually a little circular median in the middle of the intersection, and you have to circle around it all the way to take a left. And it's really annoying, but safe and whatever. Anyway, the analogy with language that I think of is exactly that when you get to an intersection of potential meanings, like the other person might mean this and you might mean that, if you don't slow down, if you just take the left, then you're going to crash.
Right.
Yeah. It's like that meme that just floats around on the internet all the time over the last couple of years, which is that, I'm happy for you to disagree with me about lots of things, just not racism and homophobia. And
right.
Well, okay, but there's a good likelihood that you and I are not using the same definition of that word when we say that.
Yeah.
And so those are intended to be conversation enders, not conversation starters.
Yes.
Yeah. Like that's not CRT is a conversation ender often, right? And that's one of those terms where, as Angel said, we need to talk about what it is and not just the term. Okay, fine. Call it something else. The point is something's happening in schools that isn't cool and we need to address it. Right. Yeah. So that whole thing is kind of a red herring as well.
Yeah, it's obscurantism. It's I wrote a piece about it for Newsweek, but this bit of it got cut out. But I was making the comparison to, what was it, 10 years ago now? Almost 10 years ago, the whole "this is not Islam. This is not CRT. This is not Islam." It's the same kind of thing. Well, look, we're talking about a thing that's happening, right? It either is related or connected in some way or it isn't. But if it is, we need to address it. And if it isn't, we need to clarify and say, look, this is a complete misunderstanding, right? But either way, the actual behavior and idea needs to be addressed. And I think that when people say, "Oh, it's legal theory," like how could anybody think that CRT is being taught to kindergartners? Like who would teach legal theory to kindergartners, right? That is an intentionally obtuse way of looking at it. Everyone knows that we're not talking about legal theory. We're talking about something else that is derivative of these sorts of ideas, right? It's distilled into and the piece I wrote about how it's like MTV used to be music television and then it became MTV and it's got less and less music in it. Well, critical race theory became CRT and it has less and less scholarship and legal theory in it. but there's still a through line. You can still connect it
Right.
to that origin point.
Yeah, it's almost like the conversation ending piece of it is almost like someone picks up a dictionary, opens it to critical race theory, and says, look,
Right.
this is what it means. This is all it means. It's a legal theory from so-and-so, and this is it. And it's like, look around. Clearly, this has become a proxy for a lot of other stuff. You can choose to ignore that, but what you're really doing is ignoring a debate that matters more, right? The debate that matters is the one that's happening. And if all you can do in response to that debate is some kind of like originalism where you go to a dictionary entry and say, this is all it is. It's like, dude, we're not textbooks here. We're a living, breathing society that's evolving, right? Like the stuff that matters is up here and in our hearts, not a book, not in some academic paper. I don't care what critical race theory used to mean. I care what it's standing for now that's making people so upset and passionate.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Let me jump in real quick because that tied for me, Monica, that tied the conversation we were having 2 minutes ago about the word woke into this term CRT, which it means different things over different times. I try not to use terms with the intent of having them be derogatory, but that's hard if you're trying to describe something that you don't like. You've got to use a term in such a way. And so that's for me, I don't accept that. I don't even like the label anti-woke for myself because I don't like the word woke. I don't like the word anti-woke. So I like to just say that I'm awake. I'm just trying to figure out what's best. And so with the word woke, you could come up with all kinds of non-derogatory ways to define it. For me, really, it boils down to just whether or not a person is willing to acknowledge that the way they are looking at race is one of many frameworks that you could choose to look at race. If you're willing to acknowledge that, then we could have a conversation about whether or not the framework you're using is the best one. But what I notice is some people, if they're fully invested in this ideology, they don't even like to acknowledge that it's a framework. It's just the way it is. It's the way the world is. It is a fish in water saying that the whole world is wet. And so for me, that's a similar thing with the CRT debate, which I do want to talk more about because as a teacher, and I kind of see this playing out. But yeah, I think to me, that's really where the line is like, I feel like any philosophy that a person has about the world should be a safe thing that they could discuss as long as they're willing to acknowledge that there are other philosophies. So
can I Starman for a moment?
Oh, I love this.
Yeah, so Angel has the the Starmaning thing. So I want to Starman, if I'm using the verb correctly, folks who are saying that like critical race theory, woke, or whatever it is, they speak of it as if it's the only way, right? Instead of there are many frameworks around race. No, I'm speaking of this framework as the best framework. And the thing that I often wonder is the way to see that from a place of goodwill, good faith is maybe that really is just the strongest way to argue that it is the best framework, to speak as if there's no other framework that could possibly compete with it. I mean, you know what I mean? Like what this makes me think of with myself is, I'm a journalist. I like moderating. I like convening. I like seeing the nuance. I'm not much of a quote unquote like fighter. Like I don't use fighting tactics. I don't get aggressive with my opinions. I always want to hear other opinions. That's just who I am. But I'm very grateful that there are people out there who go all in and go all the way, including with their language and their discourse, which presents a dilemma for me because we're talking about broken discourse. And it's like, well, if you believe in something so much and you really believe in your heart that it is the best framework, isn't actually the most, the best way that you can really represent it and to argue it is to go out there and pretend that it's the only one. I'm not saying I agree with that, but it's a dilemma. It's a tense question that is in my head a lot.
Well, yeah, you got to be your own cheerleader, right? And so I understand that, sure. But once scrutiny comes into the situation, once the conversation's being had and your ideology is being questioned, if you refuse to defend it then because you won't suffer anybody who disagrees with you, then, we have a problem. So the initial, this is the best way to go, that's fine. But now a conversation has to be had and they don't want to have that conversation. You mentioned you mentioned that you're not a fighter, right? A lot of people aren't fighters who are being called fighters, right? Simply for going against a particular anti-racist ideology. And this has happened to me. I simply ask questions, critical inquiry. It's seen as bullying, right? Asking a question is now trolling means, trolling means I don't quite understand what you're saying. Could you explain that some more? That's trolling now.
Oh my
right?
gosh. Yeah.
And right. So, I mean, even if you're not a fighter, you're seen as one, right? That's where we are
Right.
here.
I think it's even more than that. It's that when there are many of us who are convinced that we are in a fight, and so you're gonna get drafted whether you like it or not, whether
Yes.
you are willing or not. You're getting drafted into this war, and I always say that the biggest problem with the culture war is that it isn't really a war, but everyone thinks it is. And that's the thing, is you're going to get drafted. So it's either with us or against us. There are no gray areas, right? We're in the trenches. There's the no man's land between us, and there's nothing but gunfire. That's the way that people are perceiving this.
Right.
And when anyone kind of raises their hand and goes, hey, like, maybe there's another way to do this, everyone goes, oh, you must be the enemy. Only an enemy would say something like that, right? So that's
because
part
it
of
slows
too.
down the momentum of one side or the other, right? And so if both sides, again, to Starman, is like if people on both sides really feel that they are saving the world, then anyone who slows things down with a question, it comes back to what I was saying about curiosity. One of the reasons curiosity is endangered is because questions slow you down. Questions slow down the momentum. Questions add nuance when many people believe the conversation is closed. Right. And so I try to understand that point of view. I try to understand what that feels like, right? Because, hey, I mean, the other reason to Starman it is like, there probably have been times in history, I mean, there have, right? Where it's like, guys, we know this. Enough. Let's move on. Let's just accept this and move on. So it's like, as a society, live, right, raw, we have to decide, is this still a conversation? Like, are the people who are fighting just deviant, right? Because there has to be a certain point where it's like, no, dude, the earth ain't flat. We're moving on, right? But with something like this, when there's this much debate, it seems obvious that we're not at that point, and yet people still treat the other side as deviant.
Right.
That's where the danger comes in, which is, it goes back to Matt Ridley's idea about ideas having sex, and we get the best information, the best solutions from the conversations. And this is where the danger comes into that concept, though. If I believe my side is right and has already cornered the market on the correct solution, and I start shutting out other opportunities to solve, then what we're doing is we're slaughtering the progeny of those ideas coming together before it's even born.
Right.
And the long arc of human progress is following the idea babies. I could drive this analogy into the ground if I'm not careful. The idea babies are being aborted essentially before they're even born, and so that's what happens when we assume, or we believe very strongly, that our side, as for whatever sides there are, have already solved the problem, and any enemy is just going to get in the way of that. You could actually trace that to some of the worst things that have ever happened in human history.
What's funny is, so there's the one thing of just, in your fervency, right, in your dogmatic insistence that you are correct, you may miss the fact that you're mistaken, which could be disastrous, right? But setting that aside, even if you're 100% right, and you have cornered the market on the correct way to move forward, right? So let's, the earth is obviously not flat. Like, there's really no sensible discussion to be had about this in any kind of scientific sense, right? It's a known thing. It's as known as we can know anything, right? But we still have the issue of people believing the earth is flat. What are we going to do with those people? And that's what I think the problem is, that we default to, oh, they're now our enemies, we must now destroy them. But that's not the only thing you can do. Those aren't the only options, right? So I just was thinking about this the other day, and I was like, there are two ways to eliminate your enemies. One is destruction, which is what we tend to default to. There's all these incentives to do it. There's, our own kind of innate sense of we must destroy the evil kind of thing that we just have in us and we need to check. But the other way is, what I would call conversion, right? Or persuasion. But really, you're converting your enemies into allies through conversation, through all these methods that are not destroying them, right? And the reason it's so important is because the destruction thing seems like the thing to do because these people are wrong, they're evil, they're beneath contempt, et cetera, right? All the anti-star manning. But what you're doing when you destroy them is, first of all, becoming the thing you're trying to destroy in most cases, right? You also might be making a mistake. You might be destroying what looks like an enemy but isn't or wasn't. But the most important thing is that you're almost inevitably creating more enemies in doing what you're doing. And it's so much better to try to bring everyone over to your side. Now that takes more time, that takes more patience, it's more difficult, right? But it's more worthwhile because there's less of a mess. There's less bloodshed, there's less insanity.
Yeah, and it also no, yeah, I was going to say it also doesn't mean, to go back to your analogy of the flat earth versus the round earth, because we know the earth is round. So with, like you said, as much as we can know anything,
right.
It also doesn't mean we stop studying issues related to the roundness of the earth in science.
Right. Yeah.
You still dissect, you still look at the implications of the roundness. You look at how gravity is affected by the roundness. There's so many things you could go into. And I think about that with race and our discourse in the US, which of course is a disproportionately toxic discourse on race than it is in other countries because of the baggage that we have around this topic. But even if you did feel like you'd found the solution, which I think, of course, we all here, we will solve racism today in this conversation. We all know that. But even if you feel like you did, you would still not stop talking about it because it's something that we can always improve upon. We can always have more insights, and our kids and our grandkids will be able to talk about it and have insights too.
But wait, here's the added dimension, though, to make a thought experiment an absurd thought experiment. What if believing the earth was flat harmed people? Because that's the argument when it comes to race and racism, right?
Yep.
Like that there's an element of harm being done to a population whenever a certain belief is held. And that's worth considering. So if it were the case, right, if it were the case that believing that the earth is flat harms people, then the case for attacking those who hold beliefs committing the harm becomes a lot stronger.
Right. By any means necessary.
Right?
Something like that.
I would say
that's usually... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would say that what was it you just said? It kind of amplifies the need to, I wouldn't say attack. It amplifies the need to address the issue, right? That just means, okay, we need to put this front and center because people are getting hurt.
Right.
Bad things are happening. So we better have this conversation, right? That doesn't mean we need, like, it's the stakes are super high, let's just kill everyone, right? That's not the only option. And I think the thing is that we seem to default to that option. Like, let's eliminate them. Let's destroy. Let's, completely vilify and cast them out and all that sort of stuff. But we don't necessarily have to do that. We do have to address it, right? It's important. People are getting hurt. Mm-hmm. We should have the conversation. Let's figure this out. I'm always of the opinion that, it's a big boat. We're all in it and we sink or swim together for better or worse. We better accept that. There's no other boat. So throwing people overboard is throwing yourself overboard. There is no other option. So we have to figure it out.
If we genuinely are concerned with harm, then what we should do would be to try. Then the rational reaction to that would be to gather as many voices at the table as possible that don't agree, to see if their ideas will sift out something that is workable amongst many factions. But that is what we're not doing.
Right.
Right. Totally agree.
That's part of the thing that I'm trying to do with star manning is drilling down to that bedrock, right? Because I think that star manning is it's based on one simple assumption, which I think is as safe an assumption as the four of us will be hungry within the next 24 hours. I think it's that safe of an assumption. And it's that we are hardwired to want basically the same things, right? And I structure it as safety, security, satisfaction, success, right? How those things manifest then start to branch out and get really diverse and sometimes contradictory, right? But at bottom, that's what we want. And so one of the things that we definitely do not want is harm, right? We don't want to be harmed. And the vast majority of us, I think, understand that not harming others is part of that deal. Mm-hmm. And so if we start there, maybe we can make some headway. Maybe we can move forward. And so then it makes sense to bring people in who disagree with each other, right? Like for me, it makes perfect sense to seek out people who seem really smart, but whose ideas I completely disagree with, or I can't even understand, right? There are people that I've followed on Twitter where I'm like, I don't even know how they could possibly think this, but they seem smart. And so maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe I should dig deeper and try to figure out how is this person's brain working that I can't fathom right now? Because maybe it's going to illuminate a blind spot that I have that may be doing damage. And the last thing that I want is to harm myself and others.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of thing, right? It's drilling down to that thing of, hey, look, nobody here wants to suffer unnecessarily, right? The best way to figure out how to avoid that is to make sure the lines of communication are always open.
Jumping off of that, I wonder if that is one of the beliefs that so many people have really lost, which is the belief, not just that they don't want to harm others. I mean, sorry, that nobody wants to be harmed. I think the more critical one is, does any one person believe that sorry, I'm rambling a bit. So I think the troublesome thing is, can you believe that no one wants to harm anyone with their beliefs? That I think is the issue. That I think a lot of people believe that the other side wants harm. The other side is okay with harming people. My side is not. But I think that to your point, Angel, that's the flaw. That's where goodwill breaks down, right? That we can actually think, when we're quite partisan on something, that the other side wants harm. We believe it. We actually think that's what they want. That's why they're motivated. They're motivated by wanting to harm others. And that to me is like insane.
And not only that,
that,
actually, but even what Eric was saying about the by any means necessary. The minute you say by any means necessary, harm is on the table, right? It's I'm so right and you're so wrong. I am willing to hurt you to stop you. I'm willing to harm you to save the world. But
only because I think you're willing to harm so many more people, right?
Exactly.
So the first false belief is that idea that the other side just wants to harm. So it's like maybe the magic wand belief to try to like shake off of everybody is like, guys, think about that for a second. Why would anyone want to harm all other people? Like, why? How does that even make sense? How did we get to the point where we thought that was the default belief of people who disagree with us? They want harm? What kind of person is that? I mean, some people do want that. Okay, fine. But I put them in a very, very like end of the bell curve deviant place. But I think a lot of people just believe that it's closer to the center of the bell curve, like that big tall piece. And it's like, come on, that doesn't even make sense.
There's an assumption of bad faith, universal bad faith. Like anybody who disagrees with me is a bad person who wants to do harm. You are right about that. I saw it yesterday. There's a listserv, a burgeoning listserv in my field. And there's been issues with the listserv because, people think people are trying to harm people intentionally, right? And asking questions like, what do you mean by that? Is seen, as I said earlier, as trolling. So they're trying to create guidelines for speaking. Now you can see where this is going. These guidelines basically assume that anybody with a modicum of power is acting in bad faith. They're suspect. If they're asking questions, it is to figure out how to ruin you, not to understand you, right? And if you read through this whole thing, I actually pulled it up just in case I wanted to quote from it, but I'm not going to do that. I think people are trying to do the right thing. But it's basically stifling conversation. Like there's no way a genuine, authentic conversation can be had with these guidelines. Obviously, being me, I brought that up, and they seem to understand it, but it's going to be difficult to have these guidelines. I like the idea that normalize the fact that somebody who doesn't agree with you isn't trying to harm you. Right. Just normalize that. Just go into it with some good faith and see what happens. That's what I'm trying to see here, not just in my field, but in society.
Anywhere.
Yeah, of course, we're being guided towards a principle that you can assume whether or not there is good faith or not in the conversation by what the past tweets of a person are, by who else they follow, by where they seem to get their news, by what their expressed opinions already are, etc. We're also being steered towards the idea that you can assume good or bad faith about a person based on identity categories themselves. Yep. And of course, as in this conversation, as the token white guy in the panel, thank you for including me. The argument goes essentially that people like you have had a chance to have a microphone for long enough, and you need to stop giving your opinion. But then, of course, this is where we get into the tricky aspect of group averages of a thing applying to an individual. So I am 41 years old. I'm about to turn 42 in like 3 weeks. Okay. I've spent most of my life having no one pay attention to me because I was a young man who didn't know anything. And now I'm not young anymore. I've got experiences behind me and I have something to say. And also I have a microphone, so I'm going to talk into it. Right. So yes, people like me have had a microphone metaphorically for a long time, but I haven't. And this is where we get into this, and that's just a metaphor for the whole conversation, right? Where if you talk about things we should assume about a person because of the way they look, because of where they come from, because of what language they speak, because of their sexuality, whatever it is, it might apply to an aggregate big picture data average of people who look like that person, but it might have no relation at all to that person's experience. And when we assume things about people, we set up a barrier to more conversation going forward.
And whatever that person says is interpreted through a frame of bad faith. Yep. Right? Anything. Like if you ask what time it is, somehow that's, what are you trying to say? I don't know how to tell time. What are you doing? So, I mean, if that's how it's interpreted. I was once accused of trying to silence somebody by asking her to elaborate on something.
Oh my God.
Right? If somebody said, you're just trying to silence that person. I'm literally asking her to talk more. Like, how am I trying to silence her? There was an assumption that I was trying to find something to grab a hold on, to destroy her argument or something like that, instead of actually wanting to understand what she was saying. Right. So as long as this framework, this permanence to screen is there of assumed bad faith, we're in trouble. I think we need to normalize good faith assumptions initially. Perhaps through the conversation we realize this person is a schmuck, right? But
I had one where I had one where I posted something. I don't remember what it was about, but it was, I started the post with the words, in my situation, comma, I would, and then I said something. And then a person who assumed I was in bad faith, the reply was, speak for yourself.
Oh man!
I didn't even know where to go with that.
Man, yeah.
They show up already. They've already decided you're the bad guy. They show up that way, right? Yep. If you arrive at that conclusion through conversation, well, that's another thing. But they show up. I'm the good guy. You're the bad guy. Done.
Yep. Right? And Eric, you're bringing up something else that I want to normalize, again, or bring back if it was ever there, which is we can change our minds. We're fluid, evolving people. And I think that something about the fact that we have these semi-static avatar photos and Twitter profiles and, where we can choose to billboard our beliefs that we feel are strong enough that we're going to use them to filter who should even listen to us or talk to us or who we want to follow us. We'll put certain political slogans in there as beacons to who we want to hear and who don't want to hear. I think that contributes to a sense that like what you see is what you get. What you see is what you will always get. There's Eric. I know that he has some disagreements with me. And so the fact that he's asking me to elaborate is clearly coming from that place of static, unchanging opposition to me. And that is the only identity, that is the only relationship that matters to me, because he's not going to change. I'm not going to change. And we're just here to have a fight. So that's the other thing, is like something about our discourse is broken because I think something about the technology and the mediums through which we have discourse encourages a view of each other that assumes that we are static and we are here to defend our opinions, but not to actually have our ideas have sex.
Right. Yeah, it goes back to the warrior mentality, right? You're not trying to figure out what side you're on the battlefield, right? You already know. If you don't know, you're going to die real fast, right? So I think that's part of it too. And, Eric, there are a couple of interesting threads there in that situation that you brought up, because the first thing is, asking someone to elaborate is seen as an attack already, right? When it completely is not, that's not necessarily the case. But I think to me that betrays a kind of, the mindset is we're already convinced of what we're saying, and that's not why we're here.
Right.
Right. So there's actually kind of there's a mistake that is being made a lot of times, that you're participating in a conversation when it actually isn't a conversation. It's a sermon, or whatever metaphor you want to use there, right? Because if I have an idea and I state my claim, and then someone says, "Can you elaborate on that?" That means to me, oh, cool. Okay, you're listening, right, and you want this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for me to persuade you further, right? You've already kind of opened the door here, and you're saying, I'm not sure I get you. Can you keep going, right? You're giving me the floor, but because that was seen as an attack, to me that shows that we weren't at a conversation. This was about me saying the thing, and it was about you accepting the thing. It wasn't about follow-up questions. It wasn't about further inquiry. It wasn't about conversation. This isn't a conversation. So I guess that's one thing, right? It's like part of the problem with our broken discourse is that oftentimes it isn't a discourse at all, and it isn't meant to be. It's disguised as one, right? It comes in kind of dressed as one, but it isn't at all. And so maybe recognizing that early on is a good thing to do.
Yeah, we have a series of race monologues. Yeah, that's essentially what we have, and we touched on it briefly when we first signed on together, which is part of the barriers. One of the barriers I see. I want to get you guys' take on this too, which is that constantly nebulous use of language. That it's just never quite clear what definition of a word we're using when we have the conversation. And of course, the word racism is a perfect example of that. Right. We have a dictionary definition number one, which is typically, which is the idea that you believe that your race is inherently superior to others. And there's some kind of oftentimes a genetic component to that, or a cultural component to that you belong to the best one, and all the other ones are not quite as good. And there is so much baggage with that definition that the average person who is not going to listen to this type of conversation because they're just not plugged into this type of discourse at all, I would argue that definition number one is the one that most people think of when they think of that word. And then there's the definition number two, which is more like systemic. So it's your prejudice plus power and all that. And my beef is that I feel totally comfortable with both of those definitions, as long as I know which one we're talking about when we start the conversation, because I fully, and this is why I don't like the term anti-woke for myself. I see racial disparities. I see them for my students. I see them for my community, and I care about them. And I care about making them not be there as much anymore in my children's generation. I care about all that. And in the same way that anyone else who maybe considers themselves a pro CRT or a woke person would, I care just as much as you do. But in order for us to have that conversation, I need to know which definition of the word racism you're using. So what oftentimes happens is that there's this bait and switch that happens in conversations where we're going to talk about the definition number two, and then make some kind of overture for the idea that if you disagree with me about my policy solution, usually for problem number 2, or the systemic definition of racism, you are a racist, which is throwing it back into definition number 1, but nobody has acknowledged in the conversation that we have switched it to number 1. And that's a broken discourse.
Yeah. Whiteness is another one that is very similar, right? So I don't know if you guys saw, but there was we've been talking about whiteness on Twitter, in the corner of Twitter that I existed. And I made the analogy to just, imagine like Eric, imagine that a group of people just decided to call some of the worst beliefs and behaviors imaginable Eric, right? They're calling it Ericness, right?
Yeah.
And they tell you, look, it has nothing to do with the name Eric, but people who are named Eric are more susceptible just because they're named Eric, right? And then they proceed to kind of treat you like you're constantly Ericing, right? And then they say, look, it's not about you being Eric. It has nothing to do with being Eric. And you're like, but my name is Eric. And it was just the name I was given. I didn't choose it, right? But you're saying, it's so it turns into this kind of thing. I feel like, people who invoke the term whiteness are trying to eat their cake and have it too. I think they're trying, it can't be unintentional that they phase in and out of, it has everything to do with white skin and white people. And then no, it's a concept. It's about an ideology and a behavior and a system, right? And it's not actually about white people. So it's kind of like the Bible is literal when it turns out to be factually accurate, and it's metaphorical when it doesn't, and we're just going to phase in and out like that. I think part of it is a kind of, maybe people don't even realize they're doing it, but there is this phasing in and out of the different definitions depending on what point we're trying to make and what, where we're trying to go with this.
I think some people know they're doing it.
Right.
Especially within academic spheres that are well versed in these concepts of deconstructing language and all of that, but they're relying on the average person not knowing that this is happening.
Right.
Most people don't.
They're mixing up definitions on purpose because, and here's the quasi conspiracy theory, around anti-racist endeavors, right? They're trying to destroy things. They're trying to break things down, and a way to do that is to confuse language, right? Make people question reality, because they don't want to reform things. They want to completely restructure things, right? And in order to do that, they want to break things down and build it back up. There's no plan for how to build it back up, of course, right? But they seem to just want to destroy things, and one of the best ways to do that is to confuse language. And people have told me they want to just burn it down, right? They've been explicit about that, so it's not like I'm assuming things. I think it's a lot of it's on purpose.
People put burn it down in their Twitter bio. So
okay, but hang on, because I think we're veering close to two things that can be dangerous. One is, speaking about them when they're not here, and the other is speaking like assuming the intention is harmful. So what is the? But it's not an assumption.
They told me what they were doing.
Well, but is it all of them? Is it one? Is it the deviants?
Right.
Who is it? So the question I want to ask is, what is the good thing that they ultimately want?
Well, that's what I was going to jump in and say, is that even if they explicitly say, I want to destroy this, it's not because they want to harm people. It's because they want to save the world. It's because they think the thing they're destroying is a terrible thing that is harming people, and they want to eliminate it. That's what's going on here. So yeah, it's not that they have this nefarious intent to destroy good things. They're trying
so Angel, might they be right? Might they be right?
I'm very doubtful, but I'm willing to talk about it.
Yeah.
I think no idea should be a scary idea unless it becomes the only idea that's allowed.
Well put.
And that's the issue I think that we're really drilling in around here. But it kind of goes to this concept of being able to have a conversation where we acknowledge that there is a spectrum of good faith. There are people that have bad faith and do want to harm people.
Yeah.
There are people that are that way. So when we talk about the they, I like that, Monica, when you said, be careful of talking about they for that reason, but also we have to be careful that we're being specific about who they are. So there is a they within this conversation that does, like Eric said, want to tear stuff down. And that's fine that they want that, as long as they're willing to talk about why it's better than what we have now. But that's, again, seems to be that seems to be the one thing where if you were genuinely approaching with good faith, you would want to make that case.
Right.
You would want to say, what we have right now is bad, and here's why, and here's the thing I want to replace it with. That would be transparent. That would be getting people to trust you, that kind of thing. And I feel like that's one of the things that are missing from this.
And that's a very slight move, right, that you just did there. That is so important, because what you've done is you've switched things around back to, we're on the same team here. We want to mitigate harm. We want to fix the problems of society, and how we do that is talk about it. Right? You've changed it. Now they aren't a they aren't a them. It's a we now. And it's such a small thing that you just did by saying it the way you just said it. And that's the critical thing. That the resistance to that is the problem.
But Eric, what are we missing is there something we're missing in suddenly switching to trying to see, this they, and so generously? Because I want to make sure we're not like, oh no, kumbaya, it's cool. I want to know, what you're thinking.
I don't quite understand the question, actually. Sorry.
I don't understand it either.
I think I do.
Okay.
Do. So I think what she's asking is that, Eric, you are concerned when we started this part of the conversation, you are concerned with they and the desire to turn it, to burn everything down and whatever. And we're trying to acknowledge that there could be some good faith within that umbrella as well. But you're seeing something, you're having conversations that concern you. So where's the, I guess, how do we parse that out?
Well, when I say they, I'm not talking about everybody who abides by this ideology that we're talking about. There are people who have intention, right? Like the group of people I talked to yesterday about the guidelines for the listserv. They have good intentions, right? They want to do the right thing. But the people who do, are quite explicit about saying they want to burn things down, say some other crazy things as well. Like white professors are a problem, period. Right?
Whoa. Wait, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I can send you the link to that if you want.
Really?
Yeah.
What?
Yes. There was a keynote address a couple of years ago that really sparked my participation in all of this, right? And there's also there's video footage, podcasts, and things like that. Yes, the very existence of white people is an issue, right? So what is the purpose of that statement?
Right.
Right. What good could possibly come out of that statement other than here's our reason for resegregating?
Right.
Right. So statements like that make me wonder, okay, not everybody feels that way, but the leaders in my field do. Right. And they're quite explicit about that. And nobody wants to push back. Well, except for a couple of people. Right. Nobody wants to push back. And I think that's scary.
Well, I think the critical thing here is just to restate plainly that we're having we're doing two different things at the same time, right? We're trying to make sure to understand that most people, most of the time, are trying to do what they think is right and will bring about the thing that they think is best, right?
Yeah.
That can be true, and they can also be totally wrong, and despite their good intentions, be doing something destructive, right? So when they want to burn it all down, the reason we're all concerned about that is because we think that's a bad thing to do that will result in bad things, right? So we can say that and we can disagree with them and we can address it in that way without taking that extra step and saying, oh, you want to burn it all down and destroy all of this because you hate everyone and you want everyone to be miserable.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm not doing that.
No. I know you're not, but
No.
I think that's the thing that we do, all of us. We just do that kind of by default. We think, oh, you are in pursuit of this thing that I can see is bad. Therefore, you are bad. Because the only reason you could possibly be in pursuit of this thing is because you're bad. And so, we're separating that. And I think it's important to separate that.
I think that burn it all down has now become something in need of definition. As you said, you were saying, we all agree, we're all concerned about the burn it all down thing. A part of me wanted to be like, hang on, what do listeners to this conversation assume that means about what I believe? You know what I mean? It's like, what does burn it all down actually mean? And, so in case we want to talk about that, like when I hear this sort of dismissively, like they want to burn it all down, I'm like, wow, do they mean like destroy all universities, really kind of kick out everyone who's been in power traditionally and then start over? And I'll admit, like, there's a part of me that really does think that there's a lot of things about the university systems that's pretty calcified that could use a revolution. I look at tuition, I look at certain things. It's just like, man, yeah, burn it all down. The way technology disrupts things in a way that ends up like sometimes being good for the consumer. There are, I think, some systems where you do want to do that. And sometimes I go, all right, like I bend towards incrementalism because it feels safer, because I love nuance and you never have to do anything too radical. But what if sometimes you have to do things that are radical? I may not see that as soon as others would, because I have this bias against, burn it all down.
Right.
But again, it's like, I want to make sure I'm not closing myself off to what is ultimately the better solution. And I'm not saying, to any of you, I'm not saying I actually think that we should burn down universities or we should kick out all the white people. Like, no.
Right.
But I just want to put a flag on that term that is one of those that people have different definitions. What does burn it all down mean for you?
Well, I think it's an extreme sentiment. I think it's meant to be, right?
Yes.
I don't know if there's a subtle kind of interpretation of burn it all down, right? It's kind of designed to be extreme. And I think the extremity is at least what I'm
That's what you're referring to.
Yes. It's the fervency of it. It's the, no, let's do this now. Like, let's, get the Molotov cocktails. Let's do it. And I'm always like, well, hold on a second.
But very few people fall into that category. That's the thing. Right. And that's what I was trying to get into earlier, where most people, that's why this is now the third time I've established that I'm not anti-woke, because so many of my friends are woke. I care about them. I'm a musician. It's the wokest place to be. And so I care about them. And I also agree with a lot of the problems that they articulate about the world. I care about those problems too. I just don't agree with the solutions, which has also become a cliche at this point. But it's so I think the average person, so you got that tiny sliver of the academic elite type person, maybe they're just so in a bubble of other people who read all of these philosophers and whatever that they care about. But the average person adopts a lot of these race ways of talking about race in particular, because they are good people who genuinely think it's the way to solve the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where, and so I think the burn it all down crowd is a sliver of a sliver of the people involved in this conversation.
That's a really good point. Yeah, that's a really good point, is that, they're the squeaky wheels.
Mm-hmm.
They're the really, really loud ones. And obviously, because they have the most extreme views, they're the ones that are going to get that extreme attention. So, yeah, I mean, in my mind, what I was thinking with the burn it all down thing is, the people who were like, we need to dismantle capitalism, get rid of merit.
Defund the police.
Yeah, defund the police, which means abolish the police to that faction of people, right? And that's the thing, is just like Chris was saying, like, I can go with you. Yes, there are problems with the police. There are problems with capitalism. There are problems with the universities. There are problems with, the whole system of, admissions and how there's the gatekeeping there, and then there's the kind of how high the stakes are if you do not succeed in the certain tracks that we just happen to value as a society, like becoming a doctor or a lawyer. If you can't do that, you're not going to have doctor or a lawyer status. There's just no other way to get it, right? And that may doom you to, suffering, that may doom you to poverty, right? That sort of stuff. Totally, I'm totally with anyone who has criticisms about those things, and I want to solve those things. And so again, it's the extremity of the sentiment that I'm referring to.
Yeah.
Like Eric said, even though it's a sliver, there are people within leadership positions.
Yes, lots of power
within his field. It's true in my field as well. And so that is something we have to contend with.
Yeah. What's crazy, Eric, you reminded me right at the beginning of our conversation here when you were talking about how, you've heard this stuff since the 90s and you laughed at it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was quite literally played for laughs, right? There are comedians that I remember seeing as a kid who their whole routine was based around these exaggerated kind of, hyper focus on race and racism sort of stuff. Like, so this comedian, Warren Hutchinson, sorry. He had this whole bit about how his dad was, a Nation of Islam and saw racism everywhere. So even at the grocery store, right? So he'd be like trying to teach his kid, like, look, son, see, you gotta look around for where the white man is trying to control you, right? How come Frosted Flakes are great, but you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, right? And it was played for laughs. These were jokes, but now you can get a PhD in this, like that's a crazy progression. You know what I mean?
Well put.
Mm-hmm.
Damn.
Yeah, and I mentioned at the beginning that I kind of come to this from a teacher perspective, and it gives me a certain bias too towards just the way we communicate. So, as a teacher, I firmly believe that if people didn't understand me and what I meant when I communicated a thing, it's my fault. It's my fault, and so I will then change the words that I'm using. I will change the way I phrased it so that more people understand. I will come back with the assumption that it was my breakdown in communication that caused everyone in the class to not understand that concept. And right now, what I see happening on social media is almost like the opposite thing happens, which is that if you didn't understand me, it's because you're against me. Right. Because if you had been for the things I'm for, you would understand the way I use that word. You would understand the way I use that term in that context because you'd be part of that team. And we've created almost like it's not cool anymore to redefine. So we've mentioned racism, we've mentioned whiteness, and if I use that term on Twitter and someone doesn't understand what I meant by it, I would almost be socially disincentivized from picking a different word to explain the concept because that person should have just understood.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My field, right? That difference is even more stark, right? Because rhetoric is supposed to be about context, considering your audience, and speaking accordingly. It's in a sense audience-centered. If it's going to be either speaker-centered or audience-centered, it's audience-centered. Now it's speaker-centered, right? I'm going to say whatever I want. You have to cater to me. If you don't get it, then you're the problem, right? That's a huge shift in a field about communication, right? If it's happening here, then my God, no wonder it's happening everywhere else.
Mm-hmm. And there's a way that this has become a team sport that feels productive, but I think is actually counterproductive. And that is that I think that people don't expect you to understand them within the context of the conversation that you two are having. They expect you to have done your homework. They expect you to have read their bio on the internet. They expect you to have read their Twitter profile. They expect you to have gone through their links. They expect you to know a lot about them, right? I mean, we billboard so much now. Like folks billboard their pronouns, they billboard their political beliefs. And so in a way, we've distributed context about my belief to my whole team. And so it's like we've made what should be 101. Hey, conversation about what you and I believe. That's a 101 kind of thing. We've made it like a 301, a 401. We've made it so advanced. You're supposed to go and study. You're supposed to have read the New York Times cover to cover this morning to talk with me about this. There's all of these, assumptions about how much context you have picked up from this distributed conversation. That means that the individual conversation is just not actually coherent. It's not actually contained. And that, I think, is one of the most dangerous ways that our discourse has been broken, is I don't trust you and me to have a conversation starting from scratch. Oh, no. I expect you to be so knowledgeable about my side, right? And so we're coming in at this 301, 401 level where you can never connect because I don't know what you've read. I don't know what context you've picked up. And why do we expect each other to spend so much time? And that's where I start to go into things like, well, because the incentives of social media platforms is for us to spend so much time, and our attention is being given into these things, and it comes back into this advanced style of conversation that makes no sense for human interaction anymore. We can't live like this. We can't talk like this. But I see it happen over and over again, where it's a conversation between two people and one and another, jargony term about race comes up and the other person doesn't understand it. And that is reason enough to stop the conversation right there, or to think the other person is an idiot or whatever. And it's like, wait a minute, whatever happened to just having a conversation and building the context within the conversation for the meaning that you want to bring to it and that you want to persuade each other for?
The
We're
point of
outsourcing
saying,
that.
yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I'm done. Go ahead.
The point of doing things like that, saying you need to read this, that, or the other thing, is to stifle conversation.
Yes.
I'm going to shut this person up by saying this person hasn't read the right books. So it's not just about reading, it's about the interpretation of that text as well. There are sacred texts, just like in a religion. I brought up something to somebody in a situation like this, asking her to elaborate or explain something that didn't make sense to me. And she said, I think you need to just read my work.
Right.
And here's the funny thing. Not only have I read her work, I dedicated half a chapter of my last book to critiquing her work. I read her work, right? But I didn't interpret it the right way. Right? So there's one way to interpret these texts.
Right.
You can't even
so
have
it means
a conversation.
you haven't read it. You haven't read it right.
Right.
If you don't agree with
Not
me
that
as
you
a
haven't
result
read
of
it.
your reading it.
Right.
Isn't that
Right.
incredible?
Yeah.
That goes
Wow.
back to my teacher bias, where that person should have said, well, I guess I didn't write it clearly enough. Something I wrote was not clear enough, and I need to hear that criticism so that I can write something different, better next time. And so speaking of, I want to throw this in real quick because we've got some, Monica, you brought up the term race jargon that gets thrown. I mean, and we're expected to keep up with it.
Yeah.
And if we don't keep up, it changes every time you log into Twitter.
You're disqualified from the conversation if you haven't.
And it's also how you signal that you're a part of the team is whether or not you use the jargon.
Right.
So Latinx is a good example of this. There have been tons of surveys and different ways to kind of assess that the typical Spanish speaking person doesn't recognize that term or doesn't use that term on a regular basis, but we have this kind of sliver of people that use it as a way to signal their, again, wokeness, using that as a lack of a better term. And then, of course, I don't know much about Spanish, but I do know quite a bit about linguistics overall, just because of the nature of my job. And my first reaction when I came across that term was, is there any more way to center whiteness than that term, which is to say that because of my anglicized sense of gender in language, I will assume things about another language that is not my own. And apply my sense in English of what gendered language means onto their language.
Yeah.
And by doing that, signal how woke I am, which is so backwards. It's remarkable to me, but
that's particularly infuriating to me. I call it lexical imperialism. right? We're gonna
Whoa.
we're gonna take
Like that.
your savage language, right? We're going to impose our superior norms about gender onto it, and we're going to project it onto you, whether you like it or not, whether you agree or not, because we're right and you're not. And now it's just what we're going to call you, whether you want to be called that or not, right? So it's different than other kind of terms that sort of organically, happen, and some get adopted and some fall out of favor, like going from, Negro to Black to African American and then back to Black, right? Like there's an organic kind of progression there, and it's kind of happening from within the population itself, right? So there's that, right? That
Yeah.
Latinx can't happen organically because it breaks the language. It's actually, it fucks the grammar up. It's not, it doesn't work, right? You can say Latinx, but it's like a break. It doesn't make sense. And it
Yeah, it's
screws the
pretty
language,
unusual.
right? But there's also the fact that it's an imposition, right? So like Hispanic, it was not an imposition in this way. And it didn't have a political motive.
Right.
Right. It was trying to be more accurate. It was trying to say, okay, so Latin is the new term because these reasons and these populations and the differences and the connections between the languages, right? There are academic reasons for it. There are organic reasons for it. But Latinx, there's a political reason for it. And that's it. It doesn't make sense outside of that political context. So that's why I find it particularly irritating.
And that imposition is often done to perpetuate a particular narrative.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, I have to push this narrative, so I'm going to redefine or interpret these things in ways that fit that. Remember that professor, I think it was at UC Davis or something like that, who said a Chinese word that sounded like the N word?
Yeah.
Right?
Greg Patton. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what you're talking about to an extreme. The students who complained were basically telling Chinese people, your word's going to mean what I say it means.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And because I need to perpetuate this victim narrative or this white supremacist narrative. And that's all that counts. So my impositions are all for that purpose.
Right. That one was,
fascinating.
I wrote about that in a piece that I wrote about words and about how people conflate words with the ideas that the words are meant to represent and carry, and they people act like they're the same thing, and what they're in effect doing is acting as though words themselves, the combination of syllables coming out of somebody's mouth or scribbled on a page, have a magic power to harm people, right? And that's just crazy. That's infantile, and it's infantilizing, so I'm not going to say the word, but everyone knows what the word we're talking about is, right? But when Greg Patton in his class talks about filler words in Chinese, and he says this is a Chinese filler word, and it's nega, and he says it 3 times. He says nega, 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 right? And he's making a point about, the way that people use those filler words, saying basically in conversation. The context is absolutely clear. His intention is absolutely clear. And the fact that people still got upset, what they are tacitly saying is, no, those syllables coming out of that mouth have a magic power that we need to squash. And that's crazy. That's just crazy. And they don't want to be arguing that, right? They don't think they're arguing that. But that's what they're doing. When they get mad at Greg Patton, but they don't get mad at, Kendrick Lamar. That's what they're saying. What they're saying is, no. It's magic when he says it, right? And that's crazy. Yeah, that's a bugaboo of mine. I can't stand that stuff.
Yeah. I find that there's one thing that's been dancing in my head this whole conversation, which is a concept that I'm almost surprised doesn't come up more often in these kinds of conversations. Sometimes I think if you map some social dynamics just onto individual dynamics, you can see really interesting things pop up. And the word that's coming up for me is insecurity. So we've been talking about why make these impositions? Why assume bad intent? Why assume others are out to harm? And we've talked about, the vilification that happens and all these us versus them stuff. But there's also a sense of insecurity. So I'll give you an interesting example that ties back to race. So our closest friends, my family's closest friends, are Indian immigrants, and they immigrated as adults. Priya and Tessin, they're wonderful, and they're like we were COVID, bubble people together. It was awesome. Anyway, and then what was it? Not Holi, not Holi, but the other. It'll come to me. But it was an Indian festival where my friend Priya lent me Indian clothes to wear. And I put them on in her house, surrounded by Indian people, and then me, right? And then my daughter had Indian clothes as well. And then they were taking pictures to post to social media. And I was like, oh no, I cannot post a picture of myself wearing Indian clothes on social media. And Priya just looked at me and laughed. She's like, but I'm Indian and I'm giving you these clothes. And I was like, yeah, but you're, and here's where it comes back to insecurity. So yeah, okay. At the risk of maybe overgeneralizing, I'm just going to throw this out there. Priya is a recent Indian immigrant. She's very secure in her Indianness. She and her family moved to Northeast Seattle, which is a largely white area. And liberal me asked her, wait a minute, didn't you want, I'm just wondering, like, did you want a place that was more diverse? Your family's more darker skinned. Did you want a place that's more diverse? And she looked at me, she goes, Monica, when I'm around white people, it is diverse. And I was like, oh, right. You grew up around Indian darker skinned people. For you and your family being around white people, oh my gosh, right? It just blew my mind. So, and this comes from a friend of mine who's talked about this a lot, who's a Vietnamese, but she talks about how people who are, of Indian descent, of Asian descent, of whatever descent, might carry around more insecurity about what that identity truly means in American society versus people who are more recent immigrants from those places or people who are in those places, right? Like, go to India and ask Indians trying to sell you Indian clothes if it's cultural appropriation, and they'll laugh at your face too. We want your money. Buy our clothes. Wear them. What are you talking about, right? But come into the United States, and there's this, I just think it all comes down to insecurity. It's like, and I'm a Mexican immigrant, and I carry around some of that insecurity as well. Just what part of me is Mexican? What part of me is American? How much am I supposed to be? How much am I supposed to feel that I don't have a home? Should I be defending? Should I get mad when people say things on Cinco de Mayo or whatever? Like, should I get mad that someone in college is wearing a sombrero the wrong way? And it's like, am I not a good Mexican? Am I not a good Latina if I don't get mad at these things? These are the things that are sitting inside people's heads, making us so insecure as a society and getting us to make impositions, getting us to lash out, getting us to take whatever, if someone gives an inch, take a mile because you need to defend your territory. And it's like, I don't know, man. Anyway, that was I just threw a lot out there, but I'd love to.
Well, I agree with a lot of what you just said. I'm currently writing a book right now that argues that a lot of this is just about acquiring and maintaining dignity, right? There are people who, feel insecure and, they feel they don't have the proper amount of dignity. So anything that comes remotely close, right, to taking away that little dignity they have, that's going to be dangerous, and that needs to be squelched, right? So a lot of this is insecurity.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I really deeply feel this because, so I was born in New York City and briefly moved to Queens and then jumped back to Manhattan again. And I moved to New Jersey, to a suburb in New Jersey when I was 7, right? But up until I was 7, I was basically surrounded by Spanish speaking people 100% of the time, right? In school, we're talking about 90% Dominican, Puerto Rican, right? And I knew one Irish kid who lived in the building next door, right? But everybody else spoke Spanish. It's to the point where, it's Washington Heights. It's the storefronts, the signs are in Spanish. Everything is owned by Spanish speaking people, right? You see the different flags in the windows, you smell the food. I was completely immersed. Like, I may as well have immigrated from the Dominican Republic when I moved to New Jersey, right? But when I moved to New Jersey, suddenly the kid across the street from me is Indian. And, his mom has a picture of a blue elephant god on her wall. right? And she has a shrine where she burns incense and she pours water out from her balcony, right? And I'm watching this, and then I go to school, and now I'm in a place where it's probably like 75% Korean, right? People I've never seen before in my entire life. And then there's a whole cohort of kids who are Jewish. And then there are kids from Nigeria and Egypt. And it was completely multicultural, right? And that was a culture shock for me. I'm suddenly like, oh, wait, you don't believe in Jesus? Oh, wait, you don't speak Spanish? You speak something else at home? Oh, wait, you eat different food? What is this? Right. So then I had this whole progression of insecurity, that thing that you're talking about, of trying to figure, all right, well, who am I? Because I didn't think about it before, right? Everyone is the same as me. I'm what everyone else is. But now
Exactly.
everyone is different. Everything is different. What's going on? What am I, right? And, my particular situation is that nothing that I tried worked, right? So first of all, immigrant parents, right? I didn't get what I considered, not in these words, but what was basically like the tickets to acceptance. Like, I'm going to get the bike that everybody has. I'm going to get the sneakers everybody has, right? My parents are like, no way, I'm not paying for that, right? But you can get this, it's $50, right? You can get this bike. This bike is not $200. This bike is $50. You can have this bike. And, so that put me on the outside, right? And then in middle school, when we're talking about when everyone's trying to figure themselves out and get into their cliques and all that stuff, right? I'm like, well, I'm Dominican, they're Puerto Rican, right? We speak Spanish, we have the same grandma, right? We eat the same food, we understand each other. They have to accept me, right? But they didn't, because I laughed at different things. I liked different music. I dressed differently. It didn't work, right? So suddenly, even these immutable characteristics were not giving me the entry that I needed, right? So it sucked, but it ended up gifting me this thing of I need to find that thing within myself. I need to create security for myself within myself. I can't get it from these other things. And that's why I find these things kind of, misguided at the very least, right? Because all the people for whom the click thing worked, for whom, oh, if I just dress this way, if I just act this way, I'll fit in, and it worked for them, they fit in, they never got to find themselves. They're still in that thing, being the costume, right? Being the idea of a person rather than who they are. And maybe they're waking up now, right? Like, I'm 36. Maybe they're starting to wake up now and going, whoa, high school is over. Who am I? Right? And maybe that's what like midlife crises are, It's like,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah. To me, I hear a kind of a bottom line in this conversation for me, which is that one thing we could probably agree with, even if we had a bunch of people sitting here with us talking that do fall more into the they that we were talking about earlier, to a more woke person or a CRT proponent, which is that we could probably agree that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, wouldn't we all like a world where the color of each of our skins in a conversation was no more interesting than our eye color or the shape of our earlobes or whatever, and that would be a goal that most people actually, if they were asked in that way, would say, yeah, I want a future where these things don't matter, and we would all acknowledge, well, we're not there yet, and we are still having to have these conversations. But for me, the bottom line is the way I'm talking about it getting us towards that or not, or moving us away from it in whatever incremental way. And so to me, that's why this is so important. And the other thing I was observing too, when I was listening to you, Angel, just now, is that to me, this is a good example of maybe where I can acknowledge what white privilege is, because I've not had to have those identity crises, because I've grown up most of my life around people who look exactly like me, racially, and so I also grew up in the Midwest, where culturally there wasn't a lot of diversity, and so that's not the way white privilege is typically defined. But that to me is something where I can say, all right, so I can't identify with that. I don't know what that's like because of where I grew up and who I grew up around.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, for you, it's the equivalent to if I had never moved to New Jersey. Like
Right.
we had the same experience. So it's not even like a white privilege thing. It's a circumstantial thing of you're surrounded by yourself, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak, and you never realize, you never really have to have that thing of splitting yourself apart and thinking about where you stand in relation to others because you already know. And I already knew. And then that changed and I was forced to think about it.
Yeah,
Yeah, and then
I had a
think about,
guest. No, go ahead, Monica.
well, just think about how on such a massive scale that's happening now all across the country. We've seen the demographic changes. We know that this is the most multicultural generation ever, and it's only growing more so, right? Which is awesome and really cool, but it also introduces all of these interactions that make people question, as you said so beautifully, Angel, wait, who am I? And then at the same time, politics has become conflated with race to such a degree
Yeah.
that if you are Black and conservative, if you are Latino and voted for Trump, if you whatever, suddenly you have to explain yourself and you have to wonder, am I a good Republican? Am I a good conservative? Am I a good Latino? Am I a good Black person? Am I a good so and so and so and so and so and so? And there's kids on social media, right? Like teenagers growing up seeing the memes that signal to them where they're supposed to be based on any of a number of different layered identities. And so they have to do this crazy amount of work to figure out who they are in relation to this like hyper connected world they're growing up in that demands so much from them and assumes so much from them based on who they are, that expects them to billboard who they are and then defend wherever they might be surprising. It's so much easier not to be surprising. There's so much pressure to be predictable.
Yeah.
And so it comes back to what you were saying is like there's all these people who don't really know who they are because it's not just easier. I don't want to dismiss it. It's like it's kind of survival to just
it's safer.
Go
it's
with
safer.
the flow. Yeah, I mean, no one should have to do this kind of work. You know what I mean? Like this
It's
the
absolutely.
mental gymnastics. It's just
Yeah.
nuts.
It absolutely sucks. And I benefited from that experience, especially, when we were younger and it was before the whole middle school, puberty, trying to figure yourself out thing, because it was kind of, like what Chris, you were saying, we want to get to a place where, the color of the skin doesn't matter, right? I think we even want it to be slightly different than that. It's not that it doesn't matter. It's just that it matters in only a particular way, right? Because for us,
Sure.
it was like, oh, you're from Egypt? Cool. Oh, you're from Nigeria? Awesome. Oh, like what do you guys do?
Tell me about that.
It was,
Right.
it was
I'm
that sort of,
curious.
it was that, it was that sort of approach. Like, oh, wow. Like, what do you guys eat? At the lunch table, like some girls would open up their lunch boxes and there would literally be sushi in there. Right. And I'm like, what is that? And then it's like, oh, can I try that? Can I trade you? Like I'll trade you some of my plátanos and you can have some sushi and I can have some sushi and that sort of thing. It
But
was
we're
like that.
discouraged from doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Now we're kind of discouraged from doing that. So to answer your
Yeah.
question, I think we're having the conversation in the absolutely wrong way. And kind of like, what Eric was referring to at the top was, there have been echoes of this sort of thing, but everyone just kind of laughed at it. And now the tables have turned completely. And I feel like the conversation was healthier. I think even like John McWhorter has talked about this, that the conversation kind of hit a sweet spot somewhere in the 90s. We were pretty good at having this sort of conversation. There were still problems and things needed to be worked out, but we were kind of better at having the conversation then than we are now. And I mean, at least in my experience, it definitely was like that, right? Because there was no bigotry where I grew up in that way. Right? If kids hated you, it's because they thought you weren't cool. It had nothing to do with, your skin color, your ethnicity. It was never like, oh, we don't like the Jews. It was never that. It was just, that kid's lame. He's a dork. He sucks at basketball or whatever, right? And it's the thing that kids do. But we saw each other as human beings. We all just saw each other as kids. We were just kids. And the different cultural things and ethnic things and skin color things were just kind of flourishes that made us different from one another in a kind of interesting way, not in any kind of substantial way.
Yeah.
And we lost that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that.
I was going to throw in an observance, I guess, because you mentioned the 90s there. When I was a high school student in the 90s in a mostly white town, in fact, I think my graduating class was 450 kids or so, and we had maybe 10 to 15 black kids in the class. And I am not defending racist jokes. So let me make that clear. However,
this is going to be awesome.
Yeah. However, one of the ways in which we had certain conversations with, as white kids, with our black friends, like say in the locker room playing sports or whatever, was okay. For in many cases, this might be the first black kid I've ever met. Okay, and because we're all on the same team, there's an ascent, a common ground already built in, and racist jokes were a lot more common and more culturally acceptable back then. And the telling of them is not good, and that's not my point. My point was, though, we learned a lot in those locker room conversations of gross high school boys saying gross things, of where our cultural boundaries are and should be. So, for example, there might be some joke. I might hear a black kid tell a white person joke, and it's like, okay, that doesn't bother me, and I laugh, and that's funny, and yeah, we do talk like that, or whatever. And then another white kid might tell a joke that really touches on a nerve, and then somebody has that conversation. Oh, that's not cool, bro. Don't say that joke. And as kids, we learned where to touch the lines and where not to touch the lines. And so again, the point of this is not to say how great and functional racist jokes are. The point is that it's the functionality there was the conversation, the openness of the conversation that allowed some missteps to occur where their consequences were not so great. Because again, I'm talking about teenagers, okay? Where as teenagers, they need to learn to talk to each other and be able to say, hey, bro, that's not cool, back off. But tomorrow we're still friends. And that's what I'm afraid we're losing at that younger generation.
Yep, totally. It goes back to what I was saying about, like, the burden of learning about other people is now on social media. It's on media. It's these memes. It's these national signals, and conversations between people are merely places to exhibit your beliefs, defend them, protect them, and express them, right? But the learning is happening when we read articles. The learning is happening when we absorb signals and send them out. What? Right? So we're taking, learning can't happen within these small communities. These are merely places where we enforce what we learn. And what we learn comes from outside. So Angel, I was going to ask you, right? Because you talked about your community, discrimination sort of, being what it was, like not terribly present for you. Most everyone around you was kind of like you, whatever. And it's like, imagine if you had grown up now where everyone went home to their, apartments in Washington Heights and went to Instagram and then came back out on the streets. And what would those exchanges be like if we were getting our cues from there instead of from actually interacting and learning about the human beings around us? So like, and again, it makes me ask that question, well, what's good, right? What's good about the way we do it now? And like, well, one thing I always think about is speed, right? When we put the learning on these memes and whatever kind of wins out and the shaming and the culture wars, it's like, well, I suppose what could be good about that is that these norms are lightning fast. The battles are waged visibly. People pick up signals at scale. And if we're headed in the right direction, we head in that direction faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like that. And I'm glad you said that, because I have to go. And that's a great idea to go on. Very positive things like that. So Angel's got to go too.
Yeah. I was going to ask if anyone had any final thoughts.
Nope.
Okay. All right. Well, I will be in touch, guys, and we will get this out there, and hopefully we'll have a chance to squeeze in another one on a different topic
Sure.
at some point in the future. That'd be fun.
Yeah, this was excellent.
Thank you for putting this together, man.
Yeah, this was fun.
And nice meeting, a couple of you. This is great.
Yeah, yes,
sure,
more.
Man.
All right.
Awesome. All right, we'll be in touch. Okay.
All righty. Take care.
Bye, folks.